Hi there, thanks for joining the Spotlight for Security and Risk. My name is Piero DePaoli. With me is Mike Plavin.
Hi.
And a little bit later, we're going to have Anushree Randad join us to demo a few things around our security operations and governance, risk, and compliance offerings. So the first place I want to start is with security operations, and we'll spend the first part going over that. So as we look into what's new in London, there are two core applications in security operations. There's security incident response, and there's vulnerability response. And in security incident response, we have several new features. The first one is around a new security incident user interface. This allows the security analyst to really more easily navigate ServiceNow and solve their problems a little bit more quickly. The second is around a setup assistant. This really helps an organization get time to value and get security incident response up and running quickly. The third is that we've made some enhancements to really the number one use case for security incident response, which is user-reported phishing. And then finally, we've added in domain separation for our third-party integrations. Now, on the vulnerability response side, we also added the setup assistant, just like on the security incident side. This is all about helping to get that vulnerability response and vulnerability management solution up and running quickly. We've added multi-source support. We've added a few things around updating configuration item matching rules and configuration item management, some things around vulnerability group rules and remediation target rules. This is all about making it easier for the security team to be able to bulk up those different vulnerabilities and be able to patch them in different segments. Now, the two things that we want to really show you today is going to be first around security, the incident response and that new user interface. And then second, we'll walk through the setup assistant for vulnerability response. So let's start with the security incident user interface. This is all about making it more simple for that security analyst to be able to do their work. We're going to walk you through it, but you can see a quick screen there on the left-hand side. And this is where you can really quickly see all of the different incident details all in one place. There's a step-by-step guide. The playbook is over on the right-hand side. And this really shows the analysts what are the steps they need to do to get their work done. And then finally, you're able to transition from different stages of the security incident response process, such as investigation to containment to eradication. It's easier to switch between those different tasks as everything is all in one place. Now, Mike, it might be a great time to be able to show people this, but before we do, one of the things, walking through an interface isn't very fun. Why don't we show them one of the best use cases, and why don't we show them a user-reported phishing response process?
That sounds like a great idea. So here we have the new user interface for security incident response, and you can see that in it, I've logged in as you, Piero. And as a security analyst, you can have everything that you need right at your fingertips. And when you first log in, what you're actually seeing is the number of critical incidents, the number of new incidents that have been assigned to you, as well as the number of incidents that have been open for more than 24 hours. Now, what I've also got here is one particular security incident that is a user-reported phishing incident. So I'm going to click on that, and we can see that everything that I need as a security analyst is right here at my fingertips. In fact, on the right-hand side, we can see the playbook, and the step that I'm on right now is to determine whether or not the email is phishing. Now, without even having to leave the interface, I can actually look at the threat lookup results pane, and I can see that through VirusTotal, the hashes and IP addresses have come back as malicious. So I can confidently say that this email is a phishing attempt. This automatically moves me on to the next step of the playbook, which is to determine if others have received the email as well. To see that, I'm going to click on Explore, and I can do an email search. Now, the subject line's already been filled in for me, and I can select the action search. Now, we also see search and delete, which I'll come back to in just a second, but I'm going to choose search right now. What this is going to do is it's going to reach out to the Exchange server, search the mailboxes to see if any other users have received an email with that subject line. We see that they have, so I'm going to say that yes, this has been received by other users. That's going to take me to the contain step. I need to make sure that those users don't have access to that email. We're going to delete that email from the mailbox. To do so, I'm going to come back to this email search, and now I'm going to choose search and delete. That's going to reach out to that Exchange server again, and it's going to delete those messages from the mailbox. We can see that 32 emails have been found and deleted. So now that that has been completed, we can safely close this case because the threat has been eradicated. I'm going to say the threat's been mitigated. I'm going to add some close notes and save the case. The case is now closed. So we can then move on to any additional incidents that have come into the queue.
So that's really great, Mike. So you were able to do all of this with actually minimal scrolling. You didn't have to jump from one browser window to another, and you were kind of led on a path on what the steps were able to do next. And there was also a lot of automation and some orchestration in there as well. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Now, the next new feature we want to show you in security operations for London is the new Setup Assistant, and we'll show it to you for vulnerability response. This is all about being able to get vulnerability response up and running quickly. So being able to get the plugin done quickly, being able to get your integration with the scanning technology set up quickly, and then doing a lot of things around user and group management right all up front. And then finally, lots of things around risk calculators so you can really get the prioritization set up to really be customized for your organization. You can see the screen there right on the left-hand side, but Mike, why don't we show it to them?
Love to. So this is the new Vulnerability Response Setup Assistant. You can see that's a really clean interface, and it walks the user step by step through all of the things they need to do in order to set up the vulnerability response. It starts with system administration, and we'll start with setting up the users and groups. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration, I already have a group set up for my vulnerability response team, as well as the vulnerability response administrator, and we can see that the permissions have already been assigned. Since I'm happy with the way that this is configured, I'm going to mark this as complete, and that's going to automatically move me on to the next step, which is making sure that I have the integration plugin installed. So when I click on this, it brings me to a screen that shows all of the different vulnerability scanner plugins that we support, from Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable, etc. Now, for the sake of this demo, I'm going to choose the Qualys Cloud Platform. And this screen shows me the different dependencies this plugin has, as well as anything that it may not install because, in this particular case, configuration compliance is not installed. But when I click Submit, it's going to install the plugin and activate it. I've sped this process up for the purposes of the demo. It usually takes a little bit longer. But now that the plugin is installed, I'm going to mark that as complete. Now I have to actually configure the plugin itself. So I'm going to move on to integration configuration. And we can see that because the Qualys Cloud Platform is installed, I'm going to click on that to configure it. Now, the first step is to ensure that the account credentials are set up, which I've done so in my environment here. The next step is to then configure the knowledge base. The knowledge base is what Qualys uses to store their vulnerability information. So information about all of the vulnerabilities. And this is where I configure how often I want to download that information. In this case, it's going to be daily at midnight. I'm happy with that, so I'm going to move on to host detection configuration. This is where I tell ServiceNow Vulnerability Response which specific vulnerability information I want to actually download based on the severity level of the vulnerabilities. So let's say there's just way too much information in Vulnerability Response. I can uncheck Serious and only download the urgent and critical information. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm happy with the way that it's set up, so I'm going to execute that. That's going to initiate the download process immediately. Once that's done, I'm going to go back and mark this complete because the integration is now configured. With the system administration set up and the integration configuration set up, the next step is to set up vulnerability response itself. Now, there are three main steps to that: configuring the vulnerability groups, the risk calculators, and then the remediation target rules. Start with the vulnerability groups. Now, I've got one here set up by default, and this is going to group the active vulnerabilities by the vulnerability itself. So if I have a vulnerability with a specific CVE, and I've got multiple vulnerable items that match that CVE, that have that CVE, they'll all be part of that vulnerability group. So I can configure additional vulnerability groups based on departments. For example, if I want to have just marketing or HR vulnerabilities set up as their own vulnerability groups, I could do that. I'm going to mark this as complete and move on to the next step, which is risk calculators. This is how we calculate the overall business impact for the vulnerabilities themselves. I have one example here, and this is going to really just show the vulnerabilities are being calculated by a computed risk score that's going to take a few factors into consideration, such as the severity of the vulnerability, as well as things like the actual system itself. What does that system house? What is it dependent upon, and what are dependent upon that system? So I'm happy with this risk calculator, so I'm going to mark this as complete and move on to the final step, which is the remediation target rules. This is going to tell vulnerability response at what point do I need to make sure that I'm escalating this particular vulnerability. So in this particular case, I have a critical vulnerabilities need to be completed within 15 days. But there's a notification that goes out within 7 days if they haven't been resolved to the vulnerability manager. So once I'm happy with the remediation target rules, I can mark that as complete. And vulnerability response is now set up. I'm ready to go. I've got the basic administration set up, so I've got the proper users configured to have access to vulnerability response. I've got the integration configured, so I'm pulling data in from the vulnerability scanner. I've also got the vulnerability response settings configured, so I'm grouping the vulnerabilities by the groups that I want. I have my remediation targets set up as well, and I've got the risk scores configured properly.
So this is awesome because this is basically a wizard. It takes you through the 3 major steps of being able to get vulnerability response configured. This is stuff that would take people a lot of time, a lot of screens to go through. This really guides you right through exactly what you need to do.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
So why don't we move over to the recap real quickly, and to sum up the security operations section. So what we talked about is 2 main areas. The first is around simplifying the security incident response process, and this is that new security incident user interface. The second one is around getting vulnerability response up and running quickly, and that's the setup assistant that Mike just showed us. We've got the same thing for the security incident response side too. Mike, thanks so much for joining us for the demo.
Thank you.
And now joining me is Anushree Randad. Anushree, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And so we're going to talk about governance, risk, and compliance, and then specifically what's new in London. So there's really 2 main areas where we've added new features in governance, risk, and compliance. The first is around our vendor risk management application. This is really the newest thing we added to GRC, a little over a year ago. And there's 2 main things we added there. The first is added some vendor tiering capabilities. And then the second is we added integration with some security scoring vendors, specifically BitSite and Security Scorecard. And then in the core governance, risk, and compliance product, we've also added a SOX content pack, or Sarbanes-Oxley content pack. And this actually is available in the store already, and we backwards compatibility it to be able to work with Jakarta and Kingston, and London will be available really soon. But this is super important for our GRC customers. But from a demo perspective and going into a little more detail, we're going to talk about the 2 new things in vendor risk management around tiering and integration with those security scoring vendors. So let's first start with vendor tiering. And what vendor tiering is all about is being able to take the different vendors your organization's working with and being able to put them into different buckets, because you may have one vendor that has access to very sensitive data and maybe another one that doesn't. And being able to treat them differently based on whatever rules you really want to set up is why you'd be able to want to do tiering. Now, this is really being done by organizations today with spreadsheets and email, and imagine emailing hundreds or thousands of different vendors, and this is what vendor risk management really helps with. But vendor tiering takes it to another level to really give you a formal process for slotting vendors into one tier or another. So the way we do that is through 3 things, is being able to easily create the internal tiering assessments. The second is being able to automatically determine the vendor tier based on calculations. And then the third is being able to set up a scoring range for each one of those tiers. And so Anushree, do you want to walk us through a typical vendor tiering use case?
Sure. All right. So this is our vendor risk management dashboard, and what we added in London are some vendor tiering related reports. So you'll see vendors past tiering assessments, total number of vendors, vendors by different tiers, as well as the risk assessment based on tiering. Now going back to our application, vendor risk application has a new section for tiering assessment. On the vendor form, you will notice a new field for vendor tier, and initially it is set to none. Now when you start tiering your vendor, you will come to a tiering assessment related list right here, and you will create a tiering assessment for vendor. To save time, I've already created a tiering assessment, and I've set it for my vendor workfast, and I've also sending it out to Barbara, who is actually part of our compliance team. Now when I submit this assessment, and if I log in as Barbara, I will see the assessment in her queue. Now before going to Barbara, before login as Barbara, I will show you our tier-based submission rules. So these are some automated rules that I have configured in advance. Looking at the critical rule here, this rule says that if my tier changes to critical, then select the vendor risk assessment, which is the security assessment critical risk, and auto-submit this to vendor. When I do that and the tier gets calculated, the vendor risk assessment gets sent out automatically to my vendor. Now let's log in as Barbara. So when I come to Barbara and I see under my assessments and surveys, I have this survey already ready for me. I've gone ahead and filled out all the questions and responded as yes to the questions related to the nature of relationship with the vendor. This vendor, I'm assuming, is a strategic vendor. And with this vendor, we are actually sharing all the sensitive data like IP, PI, IPCI related data. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this assessment. Once I do that, on the vendor form, on the tiering form, I will see the state change at tiering assigned, and the vendor tier has been assigned as critical. Now this is based on the responses that I get from Barbara, and when I compare those responses against the vendor tiering scale, I get the critical vendor tier. Now when I close out this assessment, it is actually going to trigger our automated submission rule and going to send out the risk assessment to my vendor. Now let me go ahead and close this out. Once I close this out, I am going to receive a message on top telling me that the risk assessment has been sent out to vendor, and the vendor will receive an email with a link to our vendor portal. When I go to vendor form, I will see the vendor tier has been assigned as critical. Under assessments, I will see this auto-generated risk assessment already submitted to vendor with the assessment template that we had selected in our rule. So going to my vendor portal, I will see this assessment waiting for me as Alex Newson, who is our primary vendor contact.
Gotcha. So you were able to show creating the rule set, sending it to an internal person to go and answer some questions. Right. That automatically triggered rules so that you could send this assessment off to the third party. We're now looking at this from the view of the vendor actually receiving it. This is all stuff that would have been done via email, via spreadsheets, and would have taken a ton of time. You just did that in like 3 or 4 minutes. I mean,
That's
it
right.
might be a little bit longer when you're doing it for real, but like a few minutes versus multiple emails and days, that's really, really amazing.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next section. So the other new feature we added in governance, risk, and compliance, specific again to vendor risk management, is security scoring integration. And this is really these integrations with BitSite and with a security scorecard. And what they're really doing is monitoring the security posture of lots of different vendors out there, and then providing that information off to organizations so you can use that as a factor in determining some of the work you're doing with those different vendors. It really helps you better identify the critical vendors and some of the problems or not problems they may have. What this really does is helps you improve your continuous vendor monitoring and reducing non-compliance with your vendors. You can, with the offering, you can fine-tune those vendor tiers to more accurately reflect risk. And then you can create rules that will automatically send an assessment when those scores change. And so, Anushree, do you want to walk us through the security scoring integration and take a look at BitSite and security scorecard?
Absolutely. Coming back to my vendor form, there are a couple of fields that we added for security score integration. One is security score, another is security provider. So this tells me that the score is coming in from BitSight, which is score of 1,000. I have also this related list right here, which tells me scores from all the other providers so that I can compare between different scores. Now, BitSight and Security Score Provider Scorecard have their apps in our App Store, and once a customer installs those apps, the customers will be able to schedule these scores on, say, daily basis or weekly basis. So whenever this scheduler runs, it's going to grab the scores for the vendors in our vendor table and populate against them. Now, these score providers have different range or scale for their scores. So, say BitSight has 250 to 900, Security Scorecard has 0 to 100. What we want to do is we want to normalize the scores between these providers so we can compare them. These are my provider scores that are coming in from all these providers. What we are doing is we are actually normalizing it on a scale of 0 to 1,000 here. Now, when I so to see our automated integration with the security scorecard, what I have done is I've actually configured this rule here, which tells me that if a score drops by 10% tomorrow, then I want to send out the automated risk assessment to those vendors to find out what exactly happened. I have not selected any score provider or vendor or even a tier here because I want to apply the scores to all the vendors in my vendor table. When this rule triggers, it's going to send out the risk assessment to vendor and select this assessment template. And I'm also saying I want to auto-submit this assessment to vendor. Going back to my security scores table, now let's go ahead and create a score for WorkFast coming in from, say, BitSight, and let's say the score drops to 800. When that happens, the score actually dropped by 10%. And it gives you this message which says that the security, the risk assessment has been sent out to vendor. So when I go to WorkFast, under assessments, I will see auto-generated risk assessment due to security scorecard, which is already submitted to vendor with the assessment template that we had selected in our rule. So going to my vendor portal, I will see a security score automated assessment along with my tiering assessment.
So again, just like in the previous portion where we were showing the tiering, there's a bunch of automation that we're doing, first by pulling in the information from the different scoring vendors, normalizing the scoring so it's all on the same scale, and then creating rule sets that when scoring changes, being able to automatically send off an assessment to those different vendors to ask them what's going on. Now, this is, again, things that would happen via email, via spreadsheets, take several days. You're able to do it in a few minutes, and you've got a record of everything from end to end. Thanks so much for that, Anushree.
Thank you.
So why don't we go ahead and move to the recap. And so with governance, risk, and compliance, we really showed you two different things. The first one is controlling risk with a formal vendor tiering process. And this is all about those new vendor tiering features that Anushree showed you. The second one is being able to better identify your critical vendors, and this is the integration with those security scoring vendors. And really together, what ServiceNow GRC allows you to do is it helps you to accurately tier, continuously monitor, and properly assess your vendors, ultimately reducing your risk of a breach or non-compliance. Anushree, thanks so much for doing the demo, and thanks to all of you for watching.
Thank you.